Okay, thank you to the Academy. I'll keep that brief for now because I'm going to dive right in. Now that you are all at high energy and your peak ability to pay attention, let's talk about some of the big questions. The title of my talk is Person, Neurotechnology, and Dignity, and the reasons for that will become clear as I move through it. There are 5 things I want to touch on in this talk, and I will say ahead of time that because I have a bit to cover, I'm going to make some broad, sweeping statements. Some of you may find some of them a little bit offensive. We can always talk afterwards, and everything I am going to say will need some nuancing, but there are some key ideas that I want to talk about for neuroethics, about how it's done today, and about a specifically religious perspective on it as well. Neuroethics in the West, Europe, North America, is essentially a secular discipline, but if you go and look at the rest of the world literature, you find writings in Confucian neuroethics, Islamic neuroethics, Jewish neuroethics. Every major religious tradition has weighed in on the discipline of neuroethics, but it's not happened so much in the West. There are some examples of it, and I will touch on that tonight. But the fact is that the world's major religions have taken an interest in this already from the beginning, and the fact that we're all sitting here in this room says the Roman Catholic Church is taking an interest as well. Paul VI was talking about it in the 1960s. And I think we will hear more and more from the magisterium, the church's teaching authority, about neurotechnology and neuro issues as they touch on the human person. There is some background to that, and I want to talk about what that background is so that things that we will be hearing in the future will make sense in terms of where they come from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some history, some philosophy, and also, toward the end, take a look at what a Catholic neuroethics might look like. I have been thinking about this stuff for a while. I published 2 books in neuroethics. The second one just came out this year, Personalist Neuroethics, and I'll explain in a minute what I mean by personalism, because it's a key idea that we need to understand if we're going to make sense about what the church is going to be saying about neurotechnology and about neuroethics generally in the future. The current book I'm working on is tentatively titled Neuroethics and Catholic Bioethical Tradition. And I've asked the question, what happens when you bring into dialogue those 2 traditions? You know, neuroethics, it's from a Catholic perspective, neuroethics is just sort of starting to make its way through infancy. You know, Catholics kind of look back on a 3,000-year tradition of development going all the way back to Moses. Neuroethics has been around as a discipline since the early 2000s. Since the early 2000s, it's not even a long weekend in the history of the church. So there's 2 different ages interacting and talking to each other, but I do want to think about what that might involve. Mention was made of the International Neuroethics Society, and this is their definition of neuroethics, a field that studies the implications of neuroscience for human self-understanding, ethics, and policy. The Oxford Center for Neuroethics gives this definition, a little more broad. Neuroethics encompasses 2 different consequences of this neural revolution: the application of such neuroscientific techniques to understanding ethics and ethical implications of new technology. One thing I'd ask you to notice about both of these is that neither one of them talks about a whole human being. There's mention of one aspect of the person in the first one, but it's not a question of neurotechnology interfacing with a whole human being. But what is the current state of affairs for neuroethics? Over the past 2.5 decades or so, the bulk of it has been written by neuroscientists. There are some other disciplines that also contribute to it, obvious ones, neurology, psychiatry, some from bioethics, cognitive psychology, and philosophy, but the lion's share of the literature has been written by neuroscientists. I don't say this as a criticism of neuroscientists, but neuroscientists are trained in neuroscience. It takes a long time and a lot of work to get into the neuro world and understand it and be able to do things with it. That training does not typically include training in ethics. On the other side of the coin, you have ethicists who have had very little background in neuroscience. That's something that needs to be corrected, because if ethicists are going to talk about neuroethics, they need to understand the brain and how it works and what the rapidly developing technologies are. This is the sweeping statements part. Physics, chemistry, biology, those are our hard sciences. They developed first in physics in the beginning of the scientific revolution. From there to chemistry in the 19th century to biology, they share a common set of presuppositions, a common set of beliefs about the world that have certain consequences for the way we think about the world. Some of those presuppositions are, I would argue, one, it's a materialist vision of the world. Physics operates out of a paradigm of cause and effect, of matter and motion. Chemistry as well. Biology kept the deterministic model, but it changed cause and effect to the stimulus and response of a living organism in its environment. Those have in common a certain determinism to them. There was a philosopher by the name of John McMurray. I'm sure none of you have ever heard of him. He's Scottish, died in 1973 or so. He compared the history of science and the history of philosophy and the relationships between the two of them. At the dawn of the scientific revolution, philosophers in Europe of that age sought to bring into their philosophy the new findings of science, and they brought into philosophy a lot of the presuppositions of science. And so what do you wind up with? You wind up with people like David Hume, who are empiricist philosophers, who are materialists, and who of necessity then are going to become determinists, and yet have to ask questions in moral philosophy from a deterministic perspective. That's tough to do. McMurray said that he just described what he called 3 different fields. And what he meant by a field was a conceptual architecture, a way that we look at the world. He talked about 3 different fields, 3 different conceptual architectures, 3 kind of cosmic visions. The first he called the field of the mechanical. This is the world of physics. It looks at a material vision of the universe and how it operates. What are the laws that govern it? Can they be predicted? Can they be controlled? The field of the organic is the field of life, biological organisms. Then he pointed to a problem. The history of science and the history of philosophy along with it, from the beginning of the scientific revolution, began to look at human beings from the bottom up, from the mechanical, from the organic. He argued that there is a third field above those 2 that he called the field of the personal. What's in that field? All the things that cannot be accounted for by organism, by mechanism. Free will, he says, resides in the field of the personal. If we stay with the fields of the organic and the mechanical, we're not able to see free will. It's not there because those are deterministic visions. What he advocated for was a top-down approach. We begin with the whole person, fully conceived, robustly understood. From there, look down. Then it becomes possible to see all 3 aspects of history. If you subtract the personal, you get the field of the organic. If you then subtract the organic, you get the field of the mechanical. But you have to do it from the top down. History of science and the history of philosophy have developed more in that bottom-up sense. And so there's a looking upward at what is distinct about persons, but oftentimes in a way that doesn't allow a full understanding of what's happening. So materialism, determinism, functionalism, reductionism, these are all potential problems in a purely scientific vision of the human person, the whole person. We see it happening with the brain. What you see often in neuroethics, and this is a really typical thing, is when you read a neuroethics article, it jumps in and begins talking about a specific technology. Somewhere along the way, a little bit is said about persons, and then maybe at the end, a little bit about ethics. How do we kind of deal with this new technology? But the focus is largely on the technology. It's what the authors know most about, and so it's kind of where they begin. But as you look at the literature as a whole, there's a subtle reductionism that happens, and we begin to start to think about this as being equal to a person and to personhood. Think about questions of brain death. Do we talk about the death of a person, or do we talk about the death of one particular organ in the brain? And as was just said, the brain is a very important organ. It is unlike any other. When we talk about brain death, you find discussions like, well, how much of the brain has to be dead? What happens when the brain is dead? What can you do with the rest of the stuff that is attached to it? When it became possible to keep people cardiopulmonary alive in the 1950s and 60s, that's when the question of brain death arose, because people could be kept operating longer even if the brain was dead. So there is a view of functionalism that's present in neuroethics, talking about brain function, and what do you do when brain function falls below a certain level? And you will see, I think, argued in some of the literature that if there is no brain function, there is no person. If brain function falls below a certain level, we say that the person is dead, when the brain is dead, built on an assumption that brain equals person. Is there more to us than that or not? We heard a little bit this from in Bettina's talk. If we're going to talk about neuroethics, where do you start? What's the proper place to begin? Is it with neuroscience? Is it with neurotechnology? Is the discipline of neuroethics a neuroscience discipline or a philosophical discipline? How that question gets answered is vital because it either expands or contracts what can be done. My argument has been that neuroethics is a philosophical discipline. It's ethics about neuroscience. So it's ethical reflection on everything that happens in neuroscience vis-a-vis human beings. If you're going to start with a philosophical position, ultimately you need to start with an anthropology, a philosophical anthropology. What does it mean to be a person? Who is a person? Who is a person and who is not a person? From that vision of personhood, we can move to talk about ethics broadly. Bioethics is a subset of that process. And finally, neuroethics is a subset of bioethics, ethical reflection specifically on neuroscience. I mentioned personalism a minute ago. It is a philosophical tradition that is not terribly well known, but that has been around for a long time. Core definition of it is it's any philosophical vision that begins with the notion of the person and moves outward from there. That might sound pretty simple and straightforward, but it's a more recent philosophical vision. In the West, up until the end of the Middle Ages, philosophy did not start talking about persons, it started talking about being. As we move from Aristotle forward into the Middle Ages, it was a metaphysics, it was a philosophy of being. In the 20th century, people took a look at what had been happening in neuroscience and began to ask questions not of being, but of consciousness. The discipline where that arose was phenomenology, founded by Edmund Husserl. His first publication of logical investigations was in 1900. He began a philosophical exploration of human consciousness. What is it? What goes on in it? That became an important 20th century philosophy that's going to come back in just a moment. Personalist philosophy begins with the notion of the human person. There are different traditions within personalism. And while that term may not be familiar to you, I want to suggest in just a minute, you probably know a couple of very well-known personalist philosophers, though you may not know them by that name. There are different traditions within personalism, communitarian, dialogical. There isn't time to kind of go into each of these. I'm going to pick the bottom one, integral personalism, to talk about as a good resource, I think, for neuroethics. Who are some personalist philosophers? There was a young man who graduated from Boston University in 1955. He had gotten his doctorate in systematic theology. He credited his teachers, because Boston University was a center of personalist thought in the first half of the 20th century, he credited his teachers with giving him a personal notion of God. That is to say, a God he could be in a personal relationship with, and a God who called for justice for his people. His name is Martin Luther King Jr. You may have heard of him. Personalism is the philosophy that was the hidden driver of the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the United States. It's what he learned in school, and he put his learning into practice around questions of justice. The personalism as a philosophy has been embedded in American culture for a long time. There was another person, a little bit younger than him, who had been educated in the Thomistic tradition, the Thomistic philosophy. He also came into contact with phenomenology as a young philosopher. He had this insight. One person had done it before him, but he had this insight that Thomism and phenomenology, each of them could make up for the deficiencies in the other. And if you start a dialogue between those two positions, philosophy of being and a philosophy of consciousness, you suddenly have the capacity to think about a whole human being, to understand a person's interiority and subjectivity, to understand exteriority, to be able to talk about being, the nature of the universe, and what goes on inside. His name is Karol Wojtyła, who in 1978 was elected Pope John Paul II. That's him, right there. In his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, shortly after he became Pope, he made the striking statement that the human person is the way for the church. That's what the church needs to focus on. Because of that, he became a great proponent of human rights throughout his papacy. He drew attention to that in the way that no other Catholic Church leader had, and did so for decades. His personalist thought exists in every single document he put forth. Every single papal encyclical, a lot of the other magisterial documents. If you're not familiar with the terms too, magisterium is simply the church's teaching office. It puts out all different kinds of publications and documents. The highest teaching office of the church is a pope in conjunction with the council, all the cardinals, all the bishops together. Most of those statements are not infallible. There have only been 2 infallible statements by the papacy in the past 124 years, both of them in the 1950s, both doctrines about the Mother of God. No other word the Pope has spoken has attained that level of authority. They considered authoritative documents. When Benedict XVI got his Twitter account, the media asked him, so are all your tweets going to be infallible? No, they're not. But John Paul's thought is he left a long history of documentary personalist thought about the nature and calling and destiny of the human person. This kind of philosophical thinking, and it exists both theologically and philosophically, is embedded in the church's culture. Why is that important? There are 1.2 billion or so Catholics on the planet Earth. One example that directly impacts human lives in the United States, where I come from, the largest healthcare system in the country is the Veterans Administration System. It takes care of retired veterans, however old they are. The second largest healthcare system in the United States is the Roman Catholic Church, surpassed only by the VA. About 1 out of every 6 hospital beds in America is in a Catholic hospital. Catholic Church has been providing healthcare since at least the Middle Ages, probably before that more informally. And so there's been at least 1,000 years of thinking about the ethics of healthcare and what healthcare providers should and should not do in terms of taking care of the whole person. So this is thinking that you will continue to hear about, and that when you hear kind of magisterial statements and make some conclusions about things, you can scroll back into personalism and see where it's coming from. I think it's a useful resource to think about for neuroethics as well. These are some of the philosophers that personalist philosophers look back to as inspirations, going all the way back to the ancient world, to Plato and Aristotle, Kant, to Kierkegaard. In the 20th century, people like Jacques Maritain, Emmanuel Mounier, Gabriel Marcel, Max Scheler, Rocco Buttiglione, who lives right here in Rome, and other contemporary philosophers. Down in the bottom left-hand corner is St. Edith Stein. She was really the first person who looked at that dialogue between Thomism and personalism. She did it in the opposite direction. She was a student of Edmund Husserl, so she began with phenomenology, later became Catholic, later entered a Carmelite convent. When she became Catholic, she realized, okay, if I want to get this big picture, I need to study Thomism. So she came to Thomism from phenomenology. John Paul II came to phenomenology from Thomism, but it's essentially the same dialogue. People are writing in this tradition today. Most of the photos in color there are people who are still alive. It's a living tradition, and one that has had a profound impact radiating out from this 65-acre campus. So it's a world force, and it will continue to exert an influence on how Catholics think and view the world and on the ethical vision of the church. That makes it worth knowing. Yeah. Medical centers, hospitals, healthcare institutions generally, a lot of the ones on this planet are Catholic, and Catholic thought on bioethics has an impact beyond the church as well. Other people read those kinds of documents. As I think about personalism, I look to my own mentor and teacher, Juan Manuel Burgos. He's a Spaniard. He's a real slouch. He got his doctorate in physics at the University of Barcelona, then decided he didn't really want to be a physicist, so he came here to Rome and got a doctorate in philosophy, and has been writing about the philosophy of personalism for a couple of decades now. This is the model of the human person that he has put forth. When we say person, there are some terms out there that we kind of talk about a lot, but we often don't define them. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the United Nations uses the word dignity, but it doesn't define it. Right after World War II, there was a sense that everybody knows what that means. We don't have to define it, or we'll get it into the document, we'll think about it later. But personalist thinkers start to think about, okay, what do these words actually mean, and what are the implications of those meanings? This is a model that I've been using and thinking about and writing about neuroethics. And let me just mention, too, I know it's late, and I know we're all tired, and I'm going quick. If any of you would like a copy of my slides, they're on the little red flash drive there in the center of the table. I will leave it out till after supper tonight, so feel free to download it. He thinks about the human person as having 3 levels and 3 fundamental types of activity. a corporeal, our physical body, the psychological, our psyche, and what he calls a spiritual level of person. He's using the word spiritual there as a technical philosophical term. Those things that are not as easily categorizable, measurable. What's there? The heart, human freedom and dynamism, intelligence, experience, understanding. There are 3 levels to each of those. There's corporeal, bodily affectivity, psychological emotions, and spiritual emotions as well. The heart, love, aesthetics feelings. Human love is unlike anything that exists in the animal world. Human language, knowledge is unlike anything that exists in the animal world. It's the one area where we're all kind of stuck in that we don't have good animal models for the complexities of human language. There are things about us that are difficult to categorize looking at the world from a materialist perspective, functionalist perspective, a biological perspective. There is more to us than that. And as I said, it's at that upper level where free will resides. Are we completely free? No, we exist within a structure, and that structure places limits on us. But within those limits, we do have a lot of room to maneuver. This is just a different version of it, looking at those different aspects of person, but it's a more complex and robust vision of the person, I think, than a lot of what is out there, and it allows us, I think, to think about neuroethics in a more robust and complete way. What happens when you bring neuroethics into dialogue with Catholic bioethics? Well, Catholic bioethics has been around for a long time. There's not a specifically Catholic neuroethics out there yet, but the discussion has begun. This is my colleague Neil Messer. He was at the University of Winchester. He just went to Baylor University in Waco, Texas. He published a book a few years ago called Theological Neuroethics, Christian Ethics Meets the Science of the Human Brain. He's one of the few people who's really kind of situated well to do this because he's both a neuroscientist and a theologian, Protestant minister, teaches theology. He has some signposts that I think are worth thinking about. And in theological neuroethics, how do we think about technology? He asks these 5 questions. The International Neuroethics Society does not ask these questions. These are questions he asks from a theological perspective. Is a practice, a particular neurotechnology, a way of acting that is appropriate to creatures made in God's image, or does it reflect our desire to be like God? What attitude does a technology display toward the material world, including our own bodies? Are we looked at by a specific technology as a whole person or as raw material for use? What attitude does it demonstrate toward our neighbor? That raises questions about justice that we've just heard a little bit about, access to technologies. Is it good news to the poor? Is it going to be available to everyone and the most vulnerable among us? Will new technologies help them in some way? And lastly, what attitudes does it display toward past failures? Do we learn from our mistakes? Human problems resulting from sin. He's coming from a theological vision, so he is someone who believes in original sin. We have fallen and redeemed. The Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr once made the comment that it's really amazing that most people don't believe in original sin because it's the only theological doctrine, the only Christian doctrine for which there is overwhelming empirical evidence. But we don't often think about it. What happens when you take those kinds of questions and start to look at them from a Catholic perspective? You get 2 things right away: the image of God and the dignity of the human person. And dignity is one of those tricky words. It's philosophers would call it equivocal. Univocal word is a word that has one and one definition only. The equivocal term has a whole bunch of definitions. Imago Dei, the image of God, and the dignity of the person, very much interrelated. There are massive resources within Catholicism and Catholic bioethics to think about issues across the human lifespan, from the beginning of life to its end for injured lives. So there's a massive set of resources out there that remain really untouched by neuroethics. So if we think about Catholic neuroethics, what does that look like? First of all, the church is up against a lot. Many of you have probably read Ruth Macklin's 2-page editorial back in 2003. Its title was "Dignity is a Useless Concept." Dignity is a useless concept. Throw it out. We don't need it. She made, it's a 2-page editorial piece. It's not a reasoned article. She states some opinions and boom, she's out of there. Dignity is a useless concept in medical ethics that can be eliminated without any loss of content. What's the content you have instead? Beauchamp and Childress, Foursquare ethics. Dignity seems to have no meaning beyond what is implied by the principle of medical ethics, respect for persons, the need to obtain voluntary informed consent, requirement to protect confidentiality, and the need to avoid discrimination and abusive practices. These are all good things, but they don't give the full content, I think, of dignity. When the church thinks about dignity, what does it think about? It begins at the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Let us make man in our own image and likeness. So Adam and Eve are created. A story that is meant to be interpreted mythopoetically and understood for its meaning. What truths is it conveying about human nature and the human person? Catholics are not biblical literalists. We understand the spirit in which the Bible was written and the spirit in which it was meant to be understood. At the beginning of creation, really the pinnacle of creation, is the creation of human beings in the image and likeness of God. That image implants in us a dignity that comes from outside the world. So in the Catholic view, human dignity is a direct reflection of the nature of God. It is not granted by the state. It is not granted by any institution, and therefore it cannot be taken away by any earthly power. It's there. It's often referred to philosophically as ontological dignity. It's in us because we exist. It is something that we bear within us. We are bearers of dignity by virtue of our existence. Throughout the scriptures, Hebrew and Christian, these themes come up again and again, usually within the context of the prophets talking about justice. Catholics have both scripture and tradition. Tradition is reflection on God, reflection on the scriptures, and drawing kind of practical implications from that. It developed in moral theology. It was talked about much in terms of Vatican II, where John Paul II was one of the fathers of the council, and this notion of dignity pervades church teaching and bioethics. In my own country, there is a set of ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services put out by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Dignity is there from the beginning. The dignity of human life flows from creation in the image of God, from redemption by Jesus Christ, and from our common destiny to share a life with God beyond all corruption. That's the ultimate foundation and source of human dignity in the religious vision. Can you make an argument for human dignity philosophically? Yes, you can. It's harder to do. But the church moves from this image, but also talks about philosophical understandings of dignity. The church looks at the world and says, you know what? We all have reason, but we don't all have faith. So there needs to be a reasoned dialogue among all peoples on the planet about certain common moral foundations that we can all agree on and live by. One of the directives in that same document, the inherent dignity of the human person must be respected and protected regardless of the nature of the person's health problems or social status. Respect for human dignity extends to all persons who are served by Catholic health care. Anybody, in the city of Manchester, New Hampshire, where I work, the word is out among the homeless community and the poor. There's two hospitals in the town, the Catholic hospital on one side of the river, the secular hospital on the other. There's word out among the homeless community and the poor, if you're sick, go to the Catholic hospital because they're the ones who are not going to turn you away. They're going to take you in and care for you, while the other hospital may send you somewhere else, try to avoid all the cost of taking care of you. The tradition, and there's a long tradition of thinking about the moral life, mentioned in many documents. John Paul II wrote extensively on it. There's one particular book I want to point to, and it's by an Italian who lived right here in Rome. His name was Elio Segretia. He published a book close to 20 years ago called Personalist Bioethics, Foundations and Applications. Personalist vision of the human person, robustly understood, created in the image of God, fully human, possessed of dignity. He offers some general principles for bioethics that I think can be useful for neuroethics. There's four general principles of these: the defense of physical life, freedom and responsibility, the principle of totality, and the principle of sociality and subsidiarity. Just say a quick word about each of those. Defense of physical life. In the Catholic bioethical vision, every other right a person has is grounded upon physical life. No physical life, no need to talk about any other rights. So there's a defense of physical life from the beginning of life to its end. Freedom and responsibility. It conceives of us as free individuals, autonomous individuals, able to make decisions and responsible for our own care. In Catholic bioethics, we have a moral obligation to engage in ordinary care and take care of our lives. We're not under an obligation to use extraordinary or disproportionate means to care for ourselves, but ordinary care is considered a stewardship of our own lives, of a gift that's given by God. The principle of totality is a very important one for interventions into people. This may sound bizarre, but in Catholic bioethical thinking, you have to justify surgery because it's an intrusion on the bodily integrity of a human being. If someone is ill, if they have a diseased organ or system, and it may be necessary to remove that, that's okay to do, because the integrity and the life of the whole person is protected. If someone has cancer in the kidney or in some other part of the body, gangrenous limb, it can be removed to protect the integrity of that person's life. And also the principle of sociality and subsidiarity. Subsidiarity essentially means that you offer care at the most local level possible. If it can be done in the local community, you do it there. If the resources exceed what the local community provides, you move up to higher levels, the county, the state, the federal level. But the notion of it is the people who are closest to you who know best what the needs of the local community are. Those are good general principles, but there's also a need for what I'm calling here practical principles. What are the principles you use on the ground to make specific day-to-day decisions about people's health care? These are the principles that emerge from both moral theology and specifically Catholic bioethical thinking. There's a whole bunch of them here. We don't have time to go into them all. I'll mention just two of them, the two in the left column at the bottom, proportionate and disproportionate means. The old term is ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary care is care that is easily available, well-defined, known to work, that type of thing. Extraordinary means something that may be more experimental, something less available, something that may pose a burden on the person. People always want to make a list. Okay, what's the list of ordinary? What's the list of extraordinary? The problem with that is yesterday's extraordinary care becomes tomorrow's ordinary care. So the shifting is shifted away from the technology to the person. What's proportionate? What's disproportionate? Proportionate care is considered ordinary care, care that is readily available, like your annual physical, medications if you have a particular medical condition, stuff that's well established as effective, that doesn't put too much of a burden on a person. Disproportionate care is care that is experimental, oftentimes, may not be readily available, that puts a huge burden on the person physically, psychologically, socially, financially, whatever the case may be. Catholic thought is that we do have a moral obligation to take proportionate care, but not disproportionate care. It's the focus on the person, and it can manifest in many different ways. Consider this example. There's a woman who lives in Milan, up in the north. She has respiratory problems. Her doctor says, if you move to a drier part of Italy, Rocca Secca, where Thomas Aquinas was born, if you move to a nice dry place, then you will live longer and you'll be healthier. And the woman says, well, yeah, I could do that. And I would leave my grandchildren and never see them again because it would be hard for me to get back and forth, family to get to me. So yeah, while my life might be a year or two shorter, it's going to be apart from my family. In that instance, that care for her is disproportionate. It's going to place a burden on her of loneliness and separation from the family. Almost done? Okay. So there are principles that are useful both generally and for doing things on the ground. This is the model that I've been developing in the book. 2 slides and I'm done. At the center is a human person who has dignity and who has a right to life. Around that are those 4 basic principles I talked about. And then finally, the practical principles. The practical principles are not in any particular order here. They are all available to the person, whatever they may be. I've generally organized them from the individual to the social. The task of making a bioethical decision, and I'm going to argue a neuroethical decision, is to start with the person, take a look at the basic principles governing care for the person. In that context, to take a look at neurotechnology as a care that can be offered, and to look at some of the specific on-the-ground principles to say, is it a good to offer this care to this person? So it begins with the person and moves outward and always returns to the person and thinks about neurotechnology in a personal context for the good of the person. Stop there.